Stanford University School of Medicine, and I am delighted to be a part of the ESSIC Masterclass on interstitial cystitis. We originally were planning to present this in Antwerp just last week, but unfortunately with what's going on, we were unable to meet together, but I'm glad that we have a chance to do this on the web. We're going to start with definition, nomenclature, and diagnosis. In the 19th century, interstitial cystitis was described as a bladder disorder with discrete visible inflammation. It was first described in 1808 by Philip Singh Physic and then Joseph Parrish. Those were both general surgeons in Philadelphia, trained at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1836, Louis Mercier in Paris also described this disorder. And just an interesting bit of trivia, Mercier invented the coude catheter in 1836. Coude means elbow or bent in French, and it was not invented by Émile Coude. This was a hoax of a Welsh medical student society. But aside from that, we go to 1876, where Samuel Gross, a third general surgeon who trained at the University of Pennsylvania and then practiced at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, described this disorder. And Alexander Skene from Scotland, who practiced in New York and was a gynecologist, who described Skene's glands, also gets credit for using the term interstitial cystitis. But it wasn't until Hunter in 1915 and then 1917 wrote about this disease that it became a generally known diagnosis. He was a gynecologist at Johns Hopkins, and he described a peculiar form of bladder ulceration whose diagnosis depends ultimately on its resistance to all ordinary forms of treatment in patients with frequency and bladder symptom spasms. And this was his definition of interstitial cystitis. In 1949, a urologist at University of Oregon in Portland, J.R. Hand, published a paper describing small discrete submucosal hemorrhages and dot-like bleeding points associated with this disorder. And in 1978, Anthony Walsh in Campbell's Urology, he was a urologist in Scotland, coined the term glomerulations. That same year, a paper was published by Ed Messing and Tom Stamey from Stanford that led us off on what I would say is the wrong track for 4 decades. And they described non-specific and highly subjective symptoms of around-the-clock frequency, urgency, and pain, somewhat relieved by voiding when associated with glomerulations upon bladder distension under anesthesia. And this was the diagnosis or the definition of interstitial cystitis. It was essentially a diagnosis of exclusion in patients who had the symptoms and had either a Hunter lesion or glomerulations when their bladder was distended under sedation. Shortly afterward, the Interstitial Cystitis Association, the first big patient organization dedicated to this disease, was founded. And in 1986, I went on a morning television program, a national program in the United States, with Vicki Ratner, the founder of the Interstitial Cystitis Association. And we discussed this disorder. And at that time, it was felt to be a very rare disease. Very few patients had these symptoms, and it was considered extremely unusual. And after 2 appearances, each lasting 4 or 5 minutes during 1986, the network received 10,000 letters from patients who felt that this described their symptoms perfectly. And at this point, it was realized that this was much more common than anyone had ever thought. And the NIDDK took notice in the National Institute of Health in the United States, and they set up a meeting the following year in 1987, which was designed to define research parameters of interstitial cystitis, so that clinical and basic research findings would have a common basis for comparison. They were not looking for a de facto definition for the clinician. There was no requirement for pain actually back in 1987, but they wanted a research definition so that everyone who studied this disease and brought patients together to look at different potential treatments and different etiologies would be using the same set of patients. Now, a paper was published that same year by Magnus Fall, a urologist in Sweden. And in this paper, he said that Hunter lesion disease should not be evaluated with non-Hunter lesion disease in clinical studies. Unfortunately, no one paid much attention to this paper for 30 years, but it was prescient and turns out to be one of the most important papers in the history of interstitial cystitis bladder pain syndrome. Following the NIDDK meeting in 1987, the NIH took a major interest in funding research on interstitial cystitis, and for 5 years, they funded the Interstitial Cystitis Database, which was a gathering of information on patients who fit the NIDDK definition of interstitial cystitis, and also those who didn't fit it exactly but had similar symptoms. The next 10 years, from 1988 to 2008, they funded a search for a magic bullet, a treatment that would improve or cure this disease. When that was unsuccessful, they went back to basics, and from 2008 to 2022, they are funding what's called the multidisciplinary approach to the study of chronic pelvic pain. And in this group of studies, they've sought broader input from pain physicians, rheumatologists, gastroenterologists, and clinical and basic scientists. Now, one of the things to come out of the interstitial cystitis database, the first 5 years of that study, was to look at the NIDDK criteria and determine whether they met their purpose, and that was bringing together patients who everyone would agree had interstitial cystitis. And they were very successful because more than 90% of patients who met the NIDDK criteria were felt by experts to have this disorder. However, they were not found to be useful clinically because in patients whom all experts felt had interstitial cystitis, 60% did not fulfill the NIDDK criteria. So while they were fine for clinical and basic science studies, they could not be used by clinicians. Unfortunately, they became a de facto definition for clinicians, so many patients who had symptoms were not properly diagnosed because they did not meet NIDDK criteria, and this caused massive confusion. So in 2003, Tomohiro Ueda in Kyoto organized a meeting with urologists and gynecologists from 6 continents, and we all met in Kyoto. And this was a very important meeting, which basically served to show that we needed to come together much better than we had in the past in order to better study this disease. Everyone had different ideas about what was included under the rubric of interstitial cystitis. And this interested Jørgen Nordling in Copenhagen, and he organized a meeting in late 2003 in what would become the group called the European Society for the Study of Interstitial Cystitis. And they published 2 very influential papers in European urology. First, primary evaluation of patients suspected of having interstitial cystitis, and the following year, diagnostic criteria, classification, and nomenclature for painful bladder syndrome interstitial cystitis, an ESSIC proposal. And with all of what was going on around the world, this interested the American Urological Association. And in 2008, after a 5-year project, they published the first American guidelines for interstitial cystitis bladder pain syndrome. And The AUA defined it as an unpleasant sensation, pain, pressure, or discomfort perceived to be related to the urinary bladder, associated with lower urinary tract symptoms of more than 6 weeks duration in the absence of infection or other identifiable causes. There was no requirement for a Hunter lesion and no requirement for glomerulations to meet this definition. So the diagnosis is one of basically who meets this definition. And that can make what can appear to be complex relatively straightforward. Confusable diseases as the cause of the symptoms must be excluded. Further documentation and classification of bladder pain syndrome might be performed according to findings at cystoscopy and morphologic findings in bladder biopsies, and the presence of other organ systems or symptoms, as well as cognitive, behavioral, emotional, and sexual symptoms, should be addressed. But if you met this definition and you didn't have any other causes for it, then you had interstitial cystitis bladder pain syndrome. Now, there are numerous confusable diseases, as you can see in this long list, and we've added to them in recent years, including ketamine-induced cystitis. There are a whole bunch of these. But by taking a good history, looking at duration of symptoms, the absence of positive urine cultures, the number of voids per day, the location, character, and severity of pain, pressure, or discomfort, and findings of dyspareunia, dysuria, ejaculatory pain in men, and the relationship of pain to menstruation in women, looking at the results of O'Leary symptom and problem questionnaires, you can narrow it down pretty quickly and say that those confusable diseases are likely not causing the symptoms, and this is ICBPS or bladder pain syndrome. We use the O'Leary symptom and problem questionnaires not to make a diagnosis, but rather to follow patients in terms of their treatment response to various interventions. Also, we use pain scales and pain body maps. A Likert scale or a numerical rating scale are very helpful. With an exam, you can further narrow it down and rule out confusable disorders. An abdominal and pelvic examination should focus on areas of tenderness and trigger points. Pelvic support should be documented. A focused evaluation done should rule out vaginitis, urethritis, tender prostate, urethral diverticulum. You want to do a brief neurological examination, an ultrasound post-void residual. And finally, possible additional studies, certainly a urinalysis and urine culture to rule out infection. Cystoscopy and urodynamic testing are optional unless the diagnosis is in doubt. Suspicion of bladder cancer, vesicle stones, urethral diverticula, and intravesical foreign bodies would be indications for cystoscopy. Now, this is changing currently, but this was really as of the publication of the guidelines in 2008. We'll talk more about that in just a second. And urodynamics may be useful for suspicion of outlet obstruction, poor detrusor contractility, and to explain why patients are initially refractory to first-line therapies. So once you've done all those studies, you can rule out the vast majority of confusable diseases and leave bladder pain syndrome as the diagnosis of exclusion. It turns out it's not quite so easy. Myofascial pelvic pain can be primary or secondary to perceived bladder pain. And despite decades of research, there is no biomarker for interstitial cystitis bladder pain syndrome. No individual biomarkers are currently validated as diagnostic tools for lower urinary tract symptoms. An overactive bladder can be difficult to differentiate. There are a subset of overactive bladder patients who have pain in and or outside the pelvis. Urodynamics may help in this situation to differentiate between the two disorders. And in my opinion, the key question to get from your history is, how would you feel if there were no toilet available? Would you feel tremendous pain, pressure, or discomfort? Or would you primarily be afraid that you were going to wet yourself? In the latter situation, that's more likely overactive bladder. In the former situation, that's more likely to be bladder pain syndrome. In 2019, just last year, the International Association for the Study of Pain proposed a classification that may impact ICBPS. They noted that there are chronic primary pain syndromes where pain is the sole or leading complaint. And this could be fibromyalgia or low back pain. And this would also include bladder pain syndrome without Hunter lesions, where pain is the primary complaint. Then there are chronic secondary visceral pain syndromes, where pain is secondary to an underlying disease, such as cancer, post-traumatic, post-surgical. And in this situation, the Hunter lesion would fit in here, as you would have a cause of the pain, the Hunter lesion, and the pain would be secondary to the Hunter lesion. So this is the first inkling that there may be a difference between Hunter lesion, interstitial cystitis, and bladder pain syndrome. And that segues nicely into phenotyping of interstitial cystitis bladder pain syndrome, where we look further at the Hunter lesion and the quandary as a result of a recent FDA draft guidance. There are several issues in phenotyping. The early adaptation of unproven phenotypes in a clinical setting does us no favor. Proving the utility of a phenotype is a critical step. Phenotype refers to the observable physical properties of an organism, its appearance, development, and behavior. Utility, it should do something that's worthwhile if you make a phenotype. It should either improve diagnosis, improve prognosis, improve therapy, prevention, or help research. For a symptomatic syndrome, ultimately a phenotype could prove to be a self-contained disease and then fall out of the syndrome. And I think this is what's happened with the Hunter lesion, which is kind of fallen out of the bladder pain syndrome symptom complex as a separate disorder at this time in 2020. Regardless of what we call it or how we define it, phenotyping may hold the key to improving treatment outcomes and facilitating research. The only proven phenotype in 2020 is the Hunter lesion, which defined the disease 100 years ago. There are only a few anecdotal examples of a non-Hunter lesion patient assuming this phenotype. The patient population seems to be different than those with non-Hunter lesions. Hunter lesion, there's a major histological distinction between those with and without Hunter lesions. Think of Hunter lesion as primarily an inflammatory disorder. Inflammation is prominent, there's epithelial denudation and pancystitis. In patients without Hunter lesions, predominantly you have a non-inflammatory disorder. Inflammation may be scarce and the epithelium is generally preserved. What are some of the other differences? Well, the mean age at onset in Hunter lesion is 41 to 55 years of age. In those without a Hunter lesion, it's younger, 30 to 42. The response to cyclosporin is up to 85% in patients with Hunter lesion, and it's as low as 11% in patients without Hunter lesion. The response to fulguration, resection, or steroid injection is high in patients with Hunter lesions, and there is no response in patients without Hunter lesions. Hunter lesions have a distinct pathology. The pathology of non-Hunter lesion bladder pain syndrome is variable, and in 50% of the cases, it's normal. There are fewer comorbid conditions associated with Hunter lesion. There are many comorbid conditions, including fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel syndromes, migraine, headaches, depression, that are associated with non-Hunter lesion disease. Finally, Hunter lesion patients have a lower anatomic bladder capacity. That's capacity under anesthesia. Non-Hunter lesion patients have a larger anatomic bladder capacity under anesthesia. A functional bladder capacity while awake can be similar in both of these groups of patients. And the truth is you can't differentiate these groups of patients without cystoscopy. They can appear very similar. So what has happened in the last 100 years? In 1915, interstitial cystitis was patients with symptoms and a Hunter lesion. In 1978, interstitial cystitis was patients with a Hunter lesion or glomerulations and symptoms. As time went on, bladder pain syndrome defined a group of patients who had symptoms with or without a Hunter lesion, with or without glomerulations. And now in 2019, we're coming back to Hunter lesion as interstitial cystitis, as the original disease, a disease in and of itself, leaving bladder pain syndrome those patients without Hunter lesion. And we know now that glomerulations have very little meaning, very little sensitivity for IC or bladder pain syndrome. They have very little specificity, and in the absence of research studies, they're not important findings. So more and more people are on board with looking at Hunter lesion as a separate disease. The group in Detroit, Ken Peters' group, wrote, "We believe Hunter lesion IC is a distinct disease from non-Hunter lesion IC-BPS, and therapy should focus on the bladder." Akiyama in Japan wrote that terminology should be developed to refer separately to IC-BPS with Hunter lesions. The International Consultation on Incontinence concluded that Hunter lesion is a separate disease and should not fall under the bladder pain syndrome Venn diagram. ESSIC just wrote a paper published in the Scandinavian Journal of Urology this year, stating that it is time to accept that classic IC with Hunter lesions and bladder pain syndrome always should be evaluated separately in science as well as in clinical routine. And the new Japanese guidelines that came out this year also refer to Hunter lesion as a separate disorder, separate disease. So how common is Hunter lesion? Well, the results, the prevalence varies quite a bit. This may be because the severity and bother of symptoms to qualify as having the syndrome itself vary so much that there's misdiagnosis with confusable diseases, that survey techniques, who's diagnosed, who is surveyed, the symptoms only, how you survey makes a big difference. Which patients get cystoscopy at all? Is the cystoscopy done with local or with sedation? And is the inflammation localized, or is it more broad span? Is it more throughout the whole bladder? These are issues that may impact on how common Hunter lesion disease really is, but it's far more common than we ever used to think. If we look at all the studies that describe Hunter lesion prevalence, and we put them all together, Moldwin did this in the new Campbell's Urology, we find that 34% of patients overall have a Hunter lesion. Now, this is less in the United States, where it's as low as 10 to 15%, and much higher in Scandinavia, where it may be up to 50%. But overall, if you look for Hunter lesions, you will find them. And that goes with looking for them either under local or under sedation with bladder distension. You do not have to put the patient under sedation to find a Hunter lesion. Now, what is another possible phenotype? Bladder capacity under sedation is a biomarker for a bladder-centric versus systemic manifestation in bladder pain syndrome. Several papers have shown this now. Low bladder capacity while under anesthesia is significantly associated with high O'Leary-Santon puff scores, more acute and chronic inflammation, and higher urinary frequency and Hunter lesions. However, it's not associated with depression or other common systemic pain problems. These results suggest that low bladder capacity is a marker for bladder-centric manifestation of bladder pain syndrome, interstitial cystitis. And if we actually look at low bladder capacity versus high bladder capacity under sedation, we find that while glomerulations and symptom scores are not significantly different in the two groups, which is why one of the reasons you can't identify these patients based on symptoms alone, all of the other parameters here, the presence of Hunter lesions, inflamed mucosa, bleeding with filling, bleeding with emptying, daytime frequency and nocturia, and mean maximum voided volumes do have significant correlations with bladder capacity under sedation. Turning to biomarkers, at present, there is no biomarker with high selectivity and sensitivity suitable for the differential diagnosis of bladder pain syndrome from other diseases. Why is this? We've touched on this a little bit. There may be a heterogeneity of underlying mechanisms of bladder pain syndrome and a variability in the diagnostic criteria in the literature. So let's look at another issue now, interstitial cystitis, bladder pain syndrome, establishing effectiveness of drugs for treatment. This is a new guidance. It's actually a draft guidance, which will be modified when it comes out, I'm sure, later this year. But it was put together by the FDA in December, and this was on the basis of a meeting they had the prior year with their advisory board. And it's potentially extremely problematic. They came to four major conclusions, one of which is that clinical trials should not exclude patients based on the description of their symptoms. Well, if clinical trials can't exclude patients based on the description of their symptoms, how can you ever properly phenotype this disorder? You can't. It puts tremendous barriers in terms of drug studies trying to pick out patients who may respond to specific treatments. Secondly, they concluded ideally treatments intended for IC-BPS should improve both the bladder pain, discomfort, and lower urinary tract symptoms. Well, I would say that's a very high bar for a new treatment. If there were a new treatment that could improve just nocturia or just frequency and urgency or just pain, I would think that should meet the bar for consideration for approval. We shouldn't have to improve all of the symptoms associated with this syndrome. Their third conclusion was that randomized controlled treatment duration should be at least 6 months. I would submit that this is far too long for a clinical trial, especially for a placebo-controlled trial, which is critical in evaluating bladder pain syndrome treatments. I would think 3 months should be adequate. And finally, there was no guidance to suggest patients with and without Hunter lesions should be studied separately. And this takes us back a dozen years or more. And I really think one of the reasons that we haven't had a drug approved since 1996, when Elmeron was approved, is because we haven't properly phenotyped these patients, and that we've included Hunter lesion patients with non-Hunter lesion patients. So there's a major gulf between the FDA, which includes Hunter lesion classical IC as a part of IC-BPS, and with the world right now, which basically has concluded that Hunter lesion is diagnostic of interstitial cystitis, or you could call it Hunter lesion disease, and bladder pain syndrome is a separate syndrome, purely clinically based on symptoms and not related to Hunter lesion, other than for the fact that the symptoms are similar. So these are difficult issues to contend with. Is BPS best looked at as a syndrome, an end-stage response of the bladder to what may be many different causes or diseases? It has a wide range of responses to therapy, natural history, and it's basically a collection of symptoms. Is Hunter lesion best looked at as a disease, clinically indistinguishable from bladder pain syndrome, but it does not evolve from bladder pain syndrome? It has a distinct appearance, histology, and a distinct response to many therapies. Should bladder pain syndrome and interstitial cystitis be differentiated in all pharmaceutical trials? Well, viewed as one entity, we have failed to find convincing responses to a variety of attempted therapies in decades of trials. The use of local cystoscopy makes differentiation practical and inexpensive, so guidelines should ultimately reflect this change in thinking. And I'd like to conclude with some words from Magnus Fall, one of the founders of ESSIC, where he said, "We have to, bit by bit, identify various causes of the bladder pain syndrome, like CNS diseases, peripheral nerve damage, pelvic floor dysfunctions, inflammatory conditions, etc. Diseases so identified have to be given proper denominations and have to be included in the diagnostic algorithms. Confusable diseases. The ultimate goal is to be able to administer the proper and best treatment for each condition. In oncology, various phenotypes are identified all the time, and more intelligent and target-oriented treatments can be offered. To ignore identification of diverse clinical subgroups of ICBPS with essentially different etiology and different pathogenesis in upcoming drug studies would be an historical mistake." Thank you very much.